snuggle. Do it.
Yeah. Prepare to continue being weirdly observed for the next hour.
Bring it on. Bring it on. I can't wait. How's everyone else's day been?
When did you arrive?
4:30.
Yeah.
It's going great. Great.
We had cinnamon buns.
And sourdough.
Was it great?
So good. Oh my god. Let me tell you about this motherfucking sourdough. Okay, it's so good. The buns are incredible, but it's all incredible. It's all incredible. The sourdough, it's so like springy and bouncy and like, spongy but dense and tangy and flavorful. It's so
tell me about the cinnamon buns with the jam. How does that work? Is it good?
Oh, okay. So they were really good. These were the vegan ones, which I didn't realize at first. They didn't taste like vegan things.
I've got more buns from other batches in the freezer just for notes. This is why you have to specify which ones they are.
We're gonna
tell
have
me more about your buns.
A cinnamon bun tasting flight. Hey,
Oh, look at those cutie humans there. Hi, loves.
This is so weird.
You're okay, hon?
Yeah. You're blushing.
We're not watching you that closely, guys.
I tried to get the circle over my eye in the picture.
I did my glasses.
That makes sense.
I did it once Poetry Saturday, and it was like these kind of weird circular. It's very, very spooky. Very spooky. Where were we? Cinnamon buns. Yes, they were so good. And the kind of jam filling was really nice and like sweet, but not too sweet, and like tasted more of fruit than it did of sugar, which is nice. But the kind of the dominant flavor in all was the dough. It was the buns. It wasn't the filling. So it was just, I was very impressed.
Okay.
I was very impressed.
I have 2 different kinds of cinnamon buns from Glasgow that I need to show you when you come up and visit us. They're 2 very different ones, but they're also very, very nice. So I can't wait for you to come up and like have a sleepover a couple of days with us.
Yes. Can you tell us more about these cinnamon buns?
Can I have a hall pass for cinnamon buns?
Yeah.
Don't worry, I haven't made any of them, so there's going to be no competition between me and Zach. It's only between Zach and like legitimate like bakery businesses.
They can back right off.
I'm very much up for this cinnamon bun
tour of the UK.
Tour of the UK, yeah. Exactly. My cinnamon bun odyssey.
We can get you some from my favourite place nearby.
Who else we got? Hey Lisa, hey Martin.
Hi.
Hey Phoebe, hey Sarah. Jen's here as well. Oh, noises all around. This is so exciting. It's so weird seeing all of your faces, but like beyond you is this different environment. Hi Andrada. God, I'm really hot and sweaty already.
You're always hot.
Yep.
How's that effect on people?
You charmers. How is everybody else? How have all of your days been?
Andrada's naked.
What? Frantically scrolling through gallery view.
Scroll better.
Where?
Yeah.
Damn, son. That's fine. I'm not weird.
Your hair looks
Hey, Peanut.
Hey.
Hi, Peanut.
Hi.
Hi.
Oh,
Thank you.
acting in the physical realm.
What?
Like how happy you both look.
Oh my god, it's so cute.
Oh no! Oh no!
Oh no.
Stop looking. The strawberries, the strawberry.
Oh my god. Strawberries.
Not eating one.
No, yeah, that would be weird. But I will have one.
I do request a cinnamon bun and a sourdough like Skillshare at the next Highland Fusion when we're finally allowed to be with all the humans.
We can do that.
Mm-hmm. You can do that. I
I
will.
meant the collective.
Oh
we.
right, okay. I was
Yeah,
going to say.
Not the only person who thinks that.
Definitely.
There was a
Ainsley did
sourdough Skillshare at the last Highland Fusion.
Yeah, Ainsley did it.
Hey, Katie.
Mm.
Zach is not the only person in the world to make sourdough.
That's why I was saying we, not me.
And Katie, I'm aware that you have great buns as well.
Oh, no, I was not meaning myself. I am not an expert here. I defer to Zach for actually putting thought into it rather than just trying things.
However, Katie does have fucking fantastic cinnamon buns with this amazing glaze. I don't even know how it even works, but it is fucking incredible.
Ooh.
Butter and sugar. Butter and sugar.
I do love butter and sugar.
Hey, Abby.
Abby's here!
Your hair, Abby.
I've been catching up and then struggling to tune in on time. So, hi.
Hi,
I
Abby.
just sent Frankie a message saying Bristol because it's always
I'm in your
exciting when there are
city.
more people in Bristol. Yeah. I could
I'm
walk to where you
in
are
your
now.
house.
Yeah. I mean, just about.
Yeah.
Oh my god, Em, your hair. You've redone your hair. Your hair looks incredible.
No, I haven't changed it at all. It's just the light.
It's
I put
so
some
blue.
stuff in it to give it some texture, but that's about it.
It does look
Oh,
bluer
shit,
every
dude.
single time.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And it's like the opposite of everyone else's hair dye. Like, how do you do it?
Yeah, what on earth has your magical witch of a hairdresser put on your hair?
You know, this stuff is fucking magic, and I honestly think it's all in how she applies the dye too. Like, it's amazing. It was really cool watching because she'd start with the darkest stuff at my roots, and I was trying to semi-pay attention to where she put what foils to get that iridescent effect, but like, your guess is as good as mine.
It does look really good. I've got a haircut booked on Friday and I cannot wait. Like, I pay per length and it's cheaper when it's off your ears, but my hair has been on my ears since month 2 of lockdown. Oh. Just want it all gone.
Can you just like hack it past your ears with a pair of scissors and then go along and get
I
them
think
tidied up
it's
for
probably the
cheaper
finished
price?
length. I'm hoping it's the length when they're done and not the length when I go in. And like they've done my hair before, so they know that this is not my normal hair. I'm hoping that she knows me well enough that I can just go in and say, make me me again, and she'll know what I mean.
Just go in and burst into tears and she'll there and sit you down and take care of you and cut all of your hair off and it'll all be fine.
We've got to wear masks, and I can't imagine much more tragic than like soaking a mask with tears.
Oh,
Oh,
oh god.
How was your drive down, Frankie?
Really sweet, actually. Like totally fine, straight through, roads really kind of clear and empty. I just listened to a bunch of podcasts and Kelly Clarkson and had a really nice time.
I just waited.
Yeah. It was lush. I love driving. I would happily just drive all over the place all the time.
Yeah.
I hate driving.
Used to go to and from, do a lot more driving at the moment.
Driving's great. I think because I didn't learn until I was like 23, 24. So I kind of had like a good portion of my adult life getting buses and metros and it being really inconvenient. So then I learned and finally had a car and it was like, freedom!
I'm kind of similar, but I guess I don't live somewhere where I need to drive often. So I've only really, like, it was helpful when I was going to see my nana a lot because she was in a place where public transport was really difficult. But the actual act of driving, Like I would much rather cycle or cycle train combo for sure. Such a large margin. Cannot even express. Like
You are better people than I. I love my.
Sorry.
I
But you
love my
can't nap whilst
environmental-
driving. I like having a nap whilst on the train.
I keep cushions in my boots so that I can like stop and have a sleep in my backseat if I want to.
That's so nice.
I
I
also
like driving
learned
on like
when
the
I-
highways though, but like driving in the city is different. Like going somewhere that's like a long drive, somewhere pretty, love it. Or even just somewhere not pretty while I'm driving to get to somewhere exciting, then I'm into the drive. But as soon as
What
I'm
did
in
you
the
say?
city,
Kitty, what did you say, Dad?
Oh, I also learned when I was about like 25 or 26. So I have the same thing of very much enjoying driving, like just really loving the freedom that it gives you. Although I don't have a car, so it's only really been practically useful for getting my mum off my back.
Yeah, but that is a price beyond rubies.
Yeah.
You know, that's you can't put a price on that shit.
Get off my back, Mom!
Yeah, when you're driving like hundreds of miles a week, it gets old real quick.
Also,
Well,
Daniel drives horrific, to be fair. Like, no one likes the M8.
Oh, the image is awful. But yeah, like doing it a few times a week will kill any joy of driving fast. Lockdown's great.
I don't mind driving in the States, but I really hate it here. I'm like, this road is not big enough for 2 cars. What the fuck? I'm used to massive wide roads and very little traffic where I grew up. So driving in England is stressful.
oh yeah, I would never want to drive in England. I would be
I
so stressed out. I'd be so worried I forget what side to be on.
Yeah, that's stressful. I want to eventually go to Germany and drive on the Autobahn so I could go as fast as I like.
I had that thought a couple of days ago.
30 minutes.
It's story time. Right, everybody. Story time.
I'm gonna move out of the shop.
There he goes. There he goes.
Burbling.
So much burbling, right?
Who's burbling?
All the burbling is over now. Okay. Right.
Lift my feet up here.
Enough of that. It's quite enough of that from all of you. Kitty, put your feet away, filthy creature. No. Listen, it's story time. It's story time. And remember, you're not muted, so you just have to be quiet,
I do
like
need
by
to be
yourself.
quiet.
Now, are you sitting comfortably? And I'll begin. Chapter 43. Elizabeth, as they drove along, watched for the first appearance of Pemberley Woods with some perturbation, and when at length they turned in at the lodge, her spirits were in a high flutter. The park was very large and contained great variety of ground. They entered it in one of its lowest points and drove for some time through a beautiful wood stretching over a wide extent. Elizabeth's mind was too full for conversation, but she saw and admired every remarkable spot and point of view. They gradually ascended for half a mile, and then found themselves at the top of a considerable eminence, where the wood ceased, and the eye was instantly caught by Pemberley House, situated on the opposite side of a valley, into which the road with some abruptness wound. It was a large, handsome stone building, standing well on rising ground, and backed by a ridge of high woody hills. And in front, a stream of some natural importance was swelled into greater, but without any artificial appearance. Its banks were neither formal nor falsely adorned. Elizabeth was delighted. She had never seen a place for which nature had done more, or where natural beauty had been so little counteracted by an awkward taste. They were all of them warm in their admiration, and at that moment she felt that to be mistress of Pemberley might be something. They descended the hill, crossed the bridge, and drove to the door, and while examining the nearer aspect of the house, all her apprehensions of meeting its owner returned. She dreaded lest the chambermaid had been mistaken. On applying to see the place, they were admitted into the hall, and Elizabeth, as they waited for the housekeeper, had leisure to wonder at her being where she was. The housekeeper came. A respectable-looking, elderly woman, much less fine and more civil than she had any notion of finding her. They followed her into the dining parlour. It was a large, well-proportioned room, handsomely fitted up. Elizabeth, after slightly surveying it, went to a window to enjoy its prospect. The hill, crowned with wood from which they had descended, receiving increased abruptness from the distance, was a beautiful object. Every disposition of the ground was good, and she looked on the whole scene, the river, the trees scattered on its banks, and the winding of the valley as far as she could trace it, with delight. As they passed into other rooms, these objects were taking different positions, but from every window there were beauties to be seen. The rooms were lofty and handsome, and their furniture suitable to the fortune of their proprietor. But Elizabeth saw with admiration of his taste that it was neither gaudy nor uselessly fine, with less of splendour and more real elegance than the furniture of Rosings. And of this place, thought she, I might have been mistress. With these rooms I might now have been familiarly acquainted. Instead of viewing them as a stranger, I might have rejoiced in them as my own, and welcomed to them as visitors my aunt and uncle. But no, recollecting herself, that could never be. My uncle and aunt would have been lost to me. I should not have been allowed to invite them. This was a lucky recollection. It saved her from something like regret. She longed to inquire of the housekeeper whether her master were really absent, but had not the courage for it. At length, however, the question was asked by her uncle, and she turned away with alarm, while Mrs. Reynolds replied that he was, adding, "But we expect him tomorrow with a large party of friends." How rejoiced was Elizabeth that their own journey had not by any circumstance been delayed a day. Her aunt now called her to look at a picture. She approached and saw the likeness of Mr. Wickham suspended amongst several other miniatures over the mantelpiece. Her aunt asked her smilingly how she liked it. The housekeeper came forward and told them it was the picture of a young gentleman, the son of her late master's steward, who had been brought up by him at his own expense. "He is now gone into the army," she added, "but I am afraid he has turned out very wild." Mrs. Gardiner looked at her niece with a smile, but Elizabeth could not return it. "And that," said Mrs. Reynolds, pointing to another of the miniatures, "is my master, and very like him. It was drawn at the same time as the other, about 8 years ago." "I have heard much of your master's fine person," said Mrs. Gardiner, looking at the picture. "It is a handsome face. But, Lizzie, you can tell us whether it is like or not." Mrs. Reynolds' respect for Elizabeth seemed to increase on this intimation of her knowing her master. "Does that young lady know Mr. Darcy?" Elizabeth coloured and said, "A little." "And do not you think him a very handsome gentleman, ma'am?" "Yes, very handsome." "I am sure I know none so handsome. But in the gallery upstairs you will see a finer, larger picture of him than this. This room was my master's favourite room, and these miniatures are just as they used to be then. He was very fond of them." This accounted to Elizabeth for Mr. Wickham's being among them. Mrs. Reynolds then directed their attention to one of Miss Darcy, drawn when she was only 8 years old. "And is Miss Darcy as handsome as her brother?" said Mr. Gardiner. "Oh yes, the handsomest young lady that ever was seen, and so accomplished. She plays and sings all day long. In the next room is a new instrument just come down for her, a present from my master.
She comes here tomorrow with him. Mr. Gardiner, whose manners were easy and pleasant, encouraged her communicativeness by his questions and remarks. Mrs. Reynolds, either from pride or attachment, had evidently great pleasure in talking of her master and his sister. Is your master much at Pemberley in the course of the year? Not so much as I could wish, sir, but I dare say he may spend half his time here, and Miss Darcy is always down for the summer months. Except, thought Elizabeth, when she goes to Ramsgate. If your master would marry, you might see more of him. Yes, sir, but I do not know when that will be. I do not know who is good enough for him. Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner smiled. Elizabeth could not help saying, it is very much to his credit, I am sure, that you should think so. I say no more than the truth, and what everybody will say that knows him, replied the other. Elizabeth thought this was going pretty far, and she listened with increasing astonishment as the housekeeper added, I have never had a cross word from him in my life, and I have known him ever since he was 4 years old. This was praise of all others most extraordinary, most opposite to her ideas. That he was not a good-tempered man had been her firmest opinion. Her keenest attention was awakened. She longed to hear more, and was grateful to her uncle for saying, there are very few people of whom so much can be said. You are lucky in having such a master. Yes, sir, I know I am. If I was to go through the world, I could not meet with a better. But I have always observed that they who are good-natured when children are good-natured when they grow up, and he was always the sweetest-tempered, most generous-hearted boy in the world. Elizabeth almost stared at her. Can this be Mr. Darcy? Thought she. His father was an excellent man, said Mrs. Gardiner. Yes, ma'am, that he was indeed, and his son will be just like him, just as affable to the poor. Elizabeth listened, wondered, doubted, and was impatient for more. Mrs. Reynolds could interest her on no other point. She related the subject of the pictures, the dimensions of the rooms, and the price of the furniture in vain. Mr. Gardiner, highly amused by the kind of family prejudice to which he attributed her excessive commendation of her master, soon led again to the subject, and she dwelt with energy on his many merits as they proceeded together up the great staircase. He is the best landlord and the best master, said she, that ever lived. Not like the wild young men nowadays who think of nothing but themselves. There is not one of his tenants but servants who will give him a good name. Some people call him proud, but I am sure I never saw anything of it. To my fancy, it is only because he does not rattle away like other young men. What an amiable light does this place him, thought Elizabeth. This fine account of him, whispered her aunt as they walked, is not quite consistent with his behaviour to our poor friend. Perhaps we might be deceived. That is not very likely. Our authority was too good. On reaching the spacious lobby above, they were shown into a very pretty sitting room, lately fitted up with greater elegance and lightness than the apartments below, and were informed that it was but just done to give pleasure to Miss Darcy, who had taken a liking to the room when last at Pemberley. He is certainly a good brother, said Elizabeth as she walked towards one of the windows. Mrs. Reynolds anticipated Miss Darcy's delight when she should enter the room. And this is always the way with him, she added. Whatever can give his sister any pleasure is sure to be done in a moment. There is nothing he would not do for her. The picture gallery and 2 or 3 of the principal bedrooms were all that remained to be shown. In the former were many good paintings, but Elizabeth knew nothing of the art, and from such as had already been visible below, she had willingly turned to look at some drawings of Miss Darcy's in crayons, whose subjects were usually more interesting and also more intelligible. In the gallery there were many family portraits, but they could have little to fix the attention of a stranger. Elizabeth walked on in quest of the only face whose features would be known to her. At last it arrested her. and she beheld a striking resemblance of Mr. Darcy, with such a smile over the face as she remembered to have sometimes seen when he looked at her. She stood several minutes before the picture in earnest contemplation, and returned to it again before they quitted the gallery. Mrs. Reynolds informed them that it had been taken in his father's lifetime. There was certainly at this moment in Elizabeth's mind a more gentle sensation towards the original than she had ever felt in the height of their acquaintance. The commendation bestowed on him by Mrs. Reynolds was of no trifling nature. What praise is more valuable than the praise of an intelligent servant? As a brother, a landlord, a master, she considered how many people's happiness were in his guardianship, how much of pleasure or pain it was in his power to bestow, how much of good or evil must be done by him. Every idea that had been brought forward by the housekeeper was favourable to his character, and as she stood before the canvas on which he was represented and fixed his eyes upon herself, she thought of his regard with a deeper sentiment of gratitude than it had ever raised before, and she remembered its warmth and softened its impropriety of expression. When all of the house that was open to general inspection had been seen, they returned downstairs, and taking leave of the housekeeper, were consigned over to the gardener, who met them at the hall door. As they walked across the lawn towards the river, Elizabeth turned back to look again. Her uncle and aunt stopped also, and while the former was conjecturing as to the date of the building, the owner of it himself suddenly came forward from the road which led behind it to the stables. They were within 20 yards of each other, and so abrupt was his appearance that it was impossible to avoid his sight. Their eyes instantly met, and the cheeks of each were overspread with the deepest blush. He absolutely started, and for a moment seemed immovable from surprise, but shortly recovering himself, advanced towards the party, and spoke to Elizabeth, if not in terms of perfect composure, at least of perfect civility. She had instinctively turned away, but stopping on his approach, received his compliments with an embarrassment impossible to be overcome. Had his first appearance, or his resemblance to the picture they had just been examining, been insufficient to assure the other two that they now saw Mr. Darcy, the gardener's expression of surprise on beholding his master must immediately have told it. They stood a little aloof while he was talking to their niece, who, astonished and confused, scarcely dared lift her eyes to his face, and knew not what answer she returned to his civil inquiries after her family. Amazed at the alteration in his manner since they last parted, every sentence that he uttered was increasing her embarrassment, and every idea of the impropriety of her being found there recurring to her mind, the few minutes in which they continued together were some of the most uncomfortable of her life. Nor did he seem much more at ease. When he spoke, his accent had none of its usual sedateness, and he repeated his inquiries as to the time of her having left Longbourn, and of her stay in Derbyshire, so often and in so hurried a way as plainly spoke the distraction of his thoughts. At length, every idea seemed to fail him, and after standing a few moments without saying a word, he suddenly recollected himself and took leave. The others then joined her, and expressed their admiration of his figure, but Elizabeth heard not a word, and wholly engrossed by her own feelings, followed them in silence. She was overpowered by shame and vexation. Her coming there was the most unfortunate, the most ill-judged thing in the world. How strange it must appear to him! In what a disgraceful light might it not strike so vain a man! It might seem as if she had purposely thrown herself in his way again. Oh, why did she come? Or why did he thus come a day before he was expected? Had they been only 10 minutes sooner, they should have been beyond the reach of his discrimination, for it was plain that he was that moment arrived, that moment alighted from his horse or his carriage. She blushed again and again over the perverseness of the meeting, and his behaviour so strikingly altered. What could it mean? That he should even speak to her was amazing, but to speak with such civility, to inquire after her family. Never in her life had she seen his manners so little dignified. Never had he spoken with such gentleness as on this unexpected meeting. What a contrast did it offer to his last address in Rosings Park when he put his letter into her hand. She knew not what to think, nor how to account for it. They had now entered a beautiful walk by the side of the water, and every step was bringing forward a nobler fall of ground, or a finer reach of the woods to which they were approaching. But it was some time before Elizabeth was sensible of any of it. And though she answered mechanically to the repeated appeals of her uncle and aunt, and seemed to direct her eyes to such objects as they pointed out, she distinguished no part of the scene. Her thoughts were all fixed on that one spot at Pemberley House, whichever it might be, where Mr. Darcy then was. She longed to know what at that moment was passing in his mind, in what manner he thought of her, and whether, in defiance of everything, she was still dear to him. Perhaps he had been civil only because he felt himself at ease. Yet there had been that in his voice which was not like ease. Whether he had felt more of pain or of pleasure in seeing her, she could not tell, but he certainly had not seen her with composure. At length, however, the remarks of her companions on her absence of mind roused her, and she felt the necessity of appearing more like herself. They entered the woods, and bidding adieu to the river for a while, ascended some of the higher grounds, whence, in spots where the opening of the trees gave the eye power to wander, were many charming views of the valley, the opposite hills, with the long range of woods overspreading many, and occasionally part of the stream. Mr. Gardiner expressed a wish of going round the whole park, but feared it might be beyond a walk. With a triumphant smile, they were told that it was 10 miles around. It settled the matter, and they pursued the accustomed circuit, which brought them again, after some time, in a descent among hanging woods to the edge of the water in one of its narrowest parts. They crossed it by a simple bridge, in character with the general air of the scene. It was a spot less adorned than any they had yet visited, and the valley, here contracted into a glen, allowed room only for the stream, and a narrow walk amidst the rough coppicewood which bordered it. Elizabeth longed to explore its windings, but when they had crossed the bridge and perceived their distance from the house, Mrs. Gardiner, who was not a great walker, could go no farther, and thought only of returning to the carriage as quickly as possible. Her niece was therefore obliged to submit, and they took their way towards the house on the opposite side of the river in the nearest direction. But their progress was slow, for Mr. Gardiner, though seldom able to indulge the taste, was very fond of fishing, and was so much engaged in watching the occasional appearance of some trout in the water and talking to the man about them that he advanced but little. Whilst wandering on in this slow manner, they were again surprised, and Elizabeth's astonishment was quite equal to what it had been at first, by the sight of Mr. Darcy approaching them, and at no great distance. The walk being here less sheltered than on the other side, allowed them to see him before they met. Elizabeth, however astonished, was at least more prepared for an interview than before, and resolved to appear and to speak with calmness, if he really intended to meet them. For a few moments, indeed, she felt that he would probably strike into some other path. This idea lasted while a turning in the walk concealed him from their view. The turning past, he was immediately before them. With a glance, she saw that he had lost none of his recent civility, and to imitate his politeness, she began, as they met, to admire the beauty of the place. but she had not gone beyond the words delightful and charming when some unlucky recollections obtruded, and she fancied that praise of Pemberley from her might be mischievously construed. Her colour changed, and she said no more. Mrs. Gardiner was standing a little behind, and on her pausing, he asked her if she would do him the honour of introducing him to her friends. This was a stroke of civility for which she was quite unprepared, and she could hardly suppress a smile at his being now seeking the acquaintance of some of those very people against whom his pride had revolted in his offer to herself. What will be his surprise, thought she, when he knows who they are? He takes them now for people of fashion. The introduction, however, was immediately made, and as she named their relationship to herself, she stole a sly look at him to see how he bore it, and was not without the expectation of his decamping as fast as he could from such disgraceful companions. That he was surprised by the connection was evident. He sustained it, however, with fortitude, and so far from going away, turned back with them, and entered into conversation with Mr. Gardiner. Elizabeth could not be but pleased, could not but triumph. It was consoling that he should know that she had some relations for whom there was no need to blush. She listened most attentively to all that passed between them, and gloried in every expression, every sentence of her uncle which marked his intelligence, his taste, or his good manners. The conversation soon turned upon fishing, and she heard Mr. Darcy invite him with the greatest civility to fish there as often as he chose, while he continued at the neighbourhood, offering at the same time to supply him with fishing tackle, and pointing out those parts of the stream where there was usually most sport. Mrs. Gardiner, who was walking arm in arm with Elizabeth, gave her a look expressive of her wonder. Elizabeth said nothing, but it gratified her exceedingly. The compliment must be all for herself. Her astonishment, however, was extreme, and continually was she repeating, "Why is he so altered? From what can it proceed? It cannot be for me, it cannot be for my sake that his manners are thus softened. My reproofs at Hunsford could not work such a change as this. It is impossible that he should still love me." After walking some time in this way, the two ladies in front, the two gentlemen behind, on resuming their places after descending to the brink of the river for the better inspection of some curious water plant, there chanced to be a little alteration. It originated in Mrs. Gardiner, who, fatigued by the exercise of the morning, found Elizabeth's arm inadequate to her support, and consequently preferred her husband's. Mr. Darcy took her place by her niece, and they walked on together. After a short silence, the lady first spoke. She wished him to know that she had been assured of his absence before she came to the place, and accordingly began by observing that his arrival had been very unexpected. "For your housekeeper," she added, "informed us that you would certainly not be here till tomorrow, and indeed before we left Bakewell we understood that you were not immediately expected in the country." He acknowledged the truth of it all, and said that business with his steward had occasioned his coming forward a few hours before the rest of the party with whom he had been travelling. "They will join me tomorrow," he continued, "and among them are some who will claim an acquaintance with you, Mr. Bingley and his sisters." Elizabeth answered only with a slight bow. Her thoughts were instantly driven back to the time when Mr. Bingley's name had been last mentioned between them, and if she might judge from his complexion, his mind was not very differently engaged. "There is also one other person in the party," he continued after a pause, "who more particularly wishes to be known to you. Will you allow me, or do I ask too much, to introduce my sister to your acquaintance during your stay at Lambton?" The surprise of such an application was great indeed. It was too great for her to know in what manner she acceded to it. She immediately felt that whatever desire Miss Darcy might have of being acquainted with her must be the work of her brother, and without looking farther, it was satisfactory. It was gratifying to know that his resentment had not made him think really ill of her. They now walked on in silence, each of them deep in thought. Elizabeth was not comfortable. That was impossible. But she was flattered and pleased. His wish of introducing his sister to her was a compliment of the highest kind. They soon outstripped the others, and when they had reached the carriage, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner were half a quarter of a mile behind. He then asked her to walk into the house, but she declared herself not tired, and they stood together on the lawn. At such a time, much might have been said, and silence was very awkward. She wanted to talk, but there seemed an embargo on every subject. At last, she recollected that she had been travelling, and they talked of Matlock and Dovedale with great perseverance. Yet time and her aunt moved slowly, and her patience and her ideas were nearly worn out before the tete-a-tete was over. On Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner's coming up, they were all pressed to go into the house and take some refreshment, but this was declined, and they parted on each side with the utmost politeness. Mr. Darcy handed the ladies into the carriage, and when it drove off, Elizabeth saw him walking slowly towards the house. The observations of her uncle and aunt now began, and each of them pronounced him to be infinitely superior to anything they had expected. "He is perfectly well behaved, polite and unassuming," said her uncle. "There is something a little stately in him, to be sure," replied her aunt, "but it is confined to his air, and is not unbecoming. I can now say with the housekeeper that though some people may call him proud, I have seen nothing of it." "I was never more surprised than by his behaviour to us. It was more than civil. It was really attentive, and there was no necessity for such attention. His acquaintance with Elizabeth was very trifling." "To be sure, Lizzie," said her aunt, "he is not so handsome as Wickham, or rather he has not Wickham's countenance, for his features are perfectly good. But how came you to tell us that he was so disagreeable?" Elizabeth excused herself as well she could, said that she had liked him better when they met in Kent than before, and that she had never seen him so pleasant as this morning. "But perhaps he might be a little whimsical in his civilities," replied her uncle. "Your great men often are, and therefore I shall not take him at his word about fishing, as he might change his mind another day and warn me off his grounds." Elizabeth felt that they had entirely mistaken his character, but said nothing. "From what we have seen of him," continued Mrs. Gardiner, "I really should not have thought that he could have behaved in so cruel a way by anybody as he has done by poor Wickham. He has not an ill-natured look. On the contrary, there is something pleasing about his mouth when he speaks, and there is something of dignity in his countenance that would not give one an unfavourable idea of his heart. But to be sure, the good lady who showed us the house did give him a most flaming character. I could hardly help laughing aloud sometimes. But he is a liberal master, I suppose, and that in the eye of a servant comprehends every virtue." Elizabeth here felt herself called on to say something in vindication of his behaviour to Wickham, and therefore gave them to understand in as guarded a manner as she could, that by what she had heard from his relations in Kent, his actions were capable of a very different construction, and that his character was by no means so faulty, nor Wickham's so amiable as they had been considered in Hertfordshire. In confirmation of this, she related the particulars of all the pecuniary transactions in which they had been connected, without actually naming her authority, but stating it to be such as might be relied on. Mrs. Gardiner was surprised and concerned, but as they were now approaching the scene of her former pleasures, every idea gave way to the charm of recollection, and she was too much engaged in pointing out to her husband all the interesting spots in its environs to think of anything else. Fatigued as she had been by the morning's walk, they had no sooner dined than she set off again in quest of her former acquaintance, and the evening was spent in the satisfactions of an intercourse renewed after many years' discontinuance. The occurrences of the day were too full of interest to leave Elizabeth much attention for any of these new friends, and she could do nothing but think, and think with wonder, of Mr. Darcy's civility, and above all, of his wishing her to be acquainted with his sister. Another chapter? Chapter 44. Elizabeth had settled it that Mr. Darcy would bring his sister to visit her the very day after her reaching Pemberley, and was consequently resolved not to be out of sight of the inn for the whole of that morning. But her conclusion was false, for on the very morning after their own arrival at Lambton, these visitors came. They had been walking about the place with some of their new friends, and were just returned to the inn to dress themselves for dining with the same family, when the sound of a carriage drew them to a window, and they saw a gentleman and lady in a curricle driving up the street. Elizabeth, immediately recognising the livery, guessed what it meant, and imparted no small degree of surprise to her relations by acquainting them with the honour which she expected. Her uncle and aunt were all amazement, and the embarrassment of her manner as she spoke, joined to the circumstance itself, and many of the circumstances of the preceding day, opened to them a new idea on the business. Nothing had ever suggested it before, but they now felt that there was no other way of accounting for such attentions from such a quarter than by supposing a partiality for their niece. While these newly born notions were passing in their heads, the perturbation of Elizabeth's feelings was every moment increasing. She was quite amazed at her own discomposure, but amongst other causes of disquiet, she dreaded lest the partiality of the brother should have said too much in her favour, and more than commonly anxious to please, she naturally suspected that every power of pleasing would fail her. She retreated from the window, fearful of being seen, and as she walked up and down the room, endeavouring to compose herself, saw such looks of inquiring surprise in her uncle and aunt as made everything worse. Miss Darcy and her brother appeared, and this formidable introduction took place. With astonishment did Elizabeth see that her new acquaintance was at least as much embarrassed as herself. Since her being at Lambton, she had heard that Miss Darcy was exceedingly proud, but the observation of a very few minutes convinced her that she was only exceedingly shy. She found it difficult to obtain even a word from her beyond a monosyllable. Miss Darcy was tall and on a larger scale than Elizabeth, and though little more than 16, her figure was formed and her appearance womanly and graceful. She was less handsome than her brother, but there was sense and good humour in her face, and her manners were perfectly unassuming and gentle. Elizabeth, who had expected to find in her as acute and unembarrassed an observer as ever Mr. Darcy had been, was much relieved by discerning such different feelings. They had not been together long before Darcy told her that Bingley was also coming to wait on her, and she had barely time to express her satisfaction and prepare for such a visitor, when Bingley's quick step was heard on the stairs, and in a moment he entered the room. All Elizabeth's anger against him had been long done away, but had she still felt any, it could hardly have stood its ground against the unaffected cordiality with which he expressed himself on seeing her again. He inquired in a friendly though general way after her family, and looked and spoke with the same good-humoured ease that he had ever done. To Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, he was scarcely a less interesting person than to herself. They had long wished to see him. The whole party before them, indeed, excited a lively attention. The suspicions which had just arisen of Mr. Darcy and their niece directed their observation towards each with an earnest though guarded inquiry, and they soon drew from those inquiries the full conviction that one of them at least knew what it was to love. Of the lady's sensation they remained a little in doubt, but that the gentleman was overflowing with admiration was evident enough. Elizabeth, on her side, had much to do. She wanted to ascertain the feelings of each of her visitors. She wanted to compose her own and to make herself agreeable to all. And in the latter object, where she feared most to fail, she was most sure of success. For those to whom she endeavoured to give pleasure were prepossessed in her favour. Bingley was ready, Georgiana was eager, and Darcy determined to be pleased. In seeing Bingley, her thoughts naturally flew to her sister, and oh, how ardently did she long to know whether any of his were directed in a like manner. Sometimes she could fancy that he talked less than on former occasions, and once or twice pleased herself with the notion that as he looked at her, he was trying to trace a resemblance. But though this might be imaginary, she could not be deceived as to his behaviour to Miss Darcy, who had been set up as a rival to Jane. No look appeared on either side that spoke particular regard. Nothing occurred between them that could justify the hopes of his sister. On this point she was soon satisfied, and 2 or 3 little circumstances occurred ere they parted, which in her anxious interpretation denoted a recollection of Jane, not untinctured by tenderness, and a wish of saying more that might lead to the mention of her, had he dared. He observed to her at a moment when the others were talking together, and in a tone which had something of real regret, that it was a very long time since he had had the pleasure of seeing her. And before she could reply, he added, "It is above 8 months. We have not met since the 26th of November, when we were all dancing together at Netherfield." Elizabeth was pleased to find his memory so exact, and he afterwards took occasion to ask her, when unattended to by any of the rest, whether all her sisters were still at Longbourn. There was not much in the question, nor in the preceding remark, but there was a look and a manner which gave them meaning. It was not often that she could turn her eyes on Mr. Darcy himself, but whenever she did catch a glimpse, she saw an expression of general complacence, and in all that he said she heard an accent so far removed from hauteur or disdain of her companions as convinced her that the improvement of manners which she had yesterday witnessed, however temporary its existence might prove, had at least outlived one day. When she saw him thus seeking the acquaintance and courting the good opinion of people with whom any intercourse a few months ago would have been a disgrace, when she saw him thus civil not only to herself, but to the very relations whom he had openly disclaimed, and recollected their last lively scene in Hunsford Parsonage, the difference, the change was so great, and struck so forcibly on her mind, that she could hardly restrain her astonishment from being visible. Never, even in the company of his dear friends at Netherfield, or his dignified relations at Rosings, had she seen him so desirous to please, so free from self-consequence or unbending reserve as now, when no importance could result from the success of his endeavours, and when even the acquaintance of those to whom his attentions were addressed would draw down the ridicule and censure of the ladies both of Netherfield and Rosings. Their visitors stayed with them above half an hour, and when they arose to depart, Mr. Darcy called on his sister to join him in expressing their wish of seeing Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner and Miss Bennet to dinner at Pemberley before they left the country. Miss Darcy, though with a diffidence which marked her little in the habit of giving invitations, readily obeyed. Mrs. Gardiner looked at her niece, desirous of knowing how she, whom the invitation most concerned, felt disposed as to its acceptance, but Elizabeth had turned away her head. Presuming, however, that this studied avoidance spoke rather a momentary embarrassment than any dislike of the proposal, I've lost my place. And seeing in her husband, who was fond of society, a perfect willingness to accept it, she ventured to engage for her attendance, and the day after the next was fixed on. Bingley expressed great pleasure in the certainty of seeing Elizabeth again, having still a great deal to say to her, and many inquiries to make after all their Hertfordshire friends. Elizabeth, construing all this into a wish of hearing her speak of her sister, was pleased, and on this account, as well as some others, found herself, when her visitors left them, capable of considering the last half-hour with some satisfaction, though while it was passing, the enjoyment of it had been little. Eager to be alone, and fearful of inquiries or hints from her uncle and aunt, she stayed with them only long enough to hear their favourable opinion of Bingley, and then hurried away to dress. But she had no reason to fear Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner's curiosity. It was not their wish to force her communication. It was evident that she was much better acquainted with Mr. Darcy than they had had any idea of before. It was evident that he was very much in love with her. They saw much to interest, but nothing to justify inquiry. Of Mr. Darcy it was now a matter of anxiety to think well, and as far as their acquaintance reached, there was no fault to find. They could not be untouched by his politeness, and had they drawn his character from their own feelings and his servant's report, without any reference to the other account, the circle in Hertfordshire to which he was known, would not have recognised it for Mr. Darcy. There was now an interest, however, in believing the housekeeper, and they soon became sensible that the authority of a servant who had known him since he was 4 years old, and whose own manners indicated respectability, was not to be hastily rejected. Neither had anything occurred in the intelligence of their Lambton friends that could materially lessen its weight. They had nothing to accuse him of but pride. Pride he probably had, and if not, it would certainly be imputed by the inhabitants of a small market town where the family did not visit. It was acknowledged, however, that he was a liberal man, and did much good among the poor. With respect to Wickham, the travellers soon found that he was not held there in much estimation. For though the chief of his concerns with the son of his patron were imperfectly understood, it was yet a well-known fact that on his quitting Derbyshire he had left many debts behind him, which Mr. Darcy afterwards discharged. As for Elizabeth, her thoughts were at Pemberley this evening more than the last, and the evening, though it passed as it seemed long, was not long enough to determine her feelings towards one in that mansion, and she lay awake 2 whole hours endeavouring to make them out. She certainly did not hate him. No, hatred had vanished long ago, and she had almost as long been ashamed of ever feeling a dislike against him that could be so called. The respect created by the conviction of his valuable qualities, though at first unwillingly admitted, had for some time ceased to be repugnant to her feelings, and it was now heightened into somewhat of a friendlier nature by the testimony so highly in his favour, and bringing forward his disposition in so amiable a light which yesterday had produced. But above all, above respect and esteem, there was a motive within her of goodwill which could not be overlooked. It was gratitude. Gratitude not merely for having once loved her, but for loving her still well enough to forgive all the petulance and acrimony of her manner in rejecting him, and all the unjust accusations accompanying her rejection. He who, she had been persuaded, would avoid her as his greatest enemy, seemed, on this accidental meeting, most eager to preserve the acquaintance, and without any indelicate display of regard or any particularity of manner where their 2 selves only were concerned, was soliciting the good opinion of her friends, and bent on making her known to his sister. Such a change in a man of so much pride excited not only astonishment but gratitude, for to love, ardent love, it must be attributed. and as such its impression on her was of a sort to be encouraged, as by no means unpleasing, though it could not be exactly defined. She respected, she esteemed, she was grateful to him, she felt a real interest in his welfare, and she only wanted to know how far she wished that welfare to depend on herself, and how far it would be for the happiness of both that she should employ the power which her fancy told her she still possessed of bringing on the renewal of his addresses. It had been settled in the evening between the aunt and the niece that such a striking civility as Miss Darcy's in coming to them on the very day of her arrival at Pemberley, for she had reached it only to a late breakfast, ought to be imitated, though it could not be equalled, by some exertion of politeness on their side, and consequently that it would be highly expedient to wait on her at Pemberley the following morning. They were, therefore, to go. Elizabeth was pleased, though when she asked herself the reason, she had very little to say in reply. Mr. Gardiner left them soon after breakfast. The fishing scheme had been renewed the day before, and a positive engagement made of his meeting some of the gentlemen at Pemberley by noon. How are we doing for time?
More.
Probably more, I reckon.
The next chapter is only 4 pages long.
Settled.
Another one?
Yeah.
Don't say I don't do anything nice for you.
I would never say that, Frankie.
I mean, who wouldn't?
Shush you. Okay. You sitting comfortably? Albeit. Chapter 45. Convinced as Elizabeth now was that Miss Bingley's dislike of her had originated in jealousy, she could not help feeling how very unwelcome her appearance at Pemberley must be to her, and was curious to know with how much civility on that lady's side the acquaintance would now be renewed. On reaching the house, they were shown through the hall into the saloon, whose northern aspect rendered it delightful for summer. Its windows opening to the ground admitted a most refreshing view of the high woody hills behind the house, and of the beautiful oaks and Spanish chestnuts which were scattered over the intermediate lawn. In this room they were received by Miss Darcy, who was fuck up. I'm so sorry. Everybody send bad vibes at Zach for ruining story time. Right, where had I got to? Chestnuts. In this room they were received by Miss Darcy, who was sitting there with Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley, and the lady with whom she lived in London. Georgiana's reception of them was very civil, but attended with all that embarrassment which, though proceeding from shyness and the fear of doing wrong, would easily give to those who felt themselves inferior the belief of her being proud and reserved. Mrs. Gardiner and her niece, however, did her justice and pitied her. By Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley they were noticed only by a curtsy, and on their being seated, a pause, awkward as such pauses must always be, succeeded for a few moments. It was first broken by Mrs. Annesley, a genteel, agreeable-looking woman, whose endeavour to introduce some kind of discourse proved her to be more truly well-bred than either of the others, and between her and Mrs. Gardiner, with occasional help from Elizabeth, the conversation was carried on. Miss Darcy looked as if she wished for courage enough to join in it, and sometimes did venture a short sentence when there was least danger of it being heard. Elizabeth soon saw that she was herself closely watched by Miss Bingley, and that she could not speak a word, especially to Miss Darcy, without calling her attention. This observation would not have prevented her from trying to talk to the latter, had they not been seated at an inconvenient distance, but she was not sorry to be spared the necessity of saying much. Her own thoughts were employing her. She expected every moment that some of the gentlemen would enter the room, She wished, she feared that the master of the house might be amongst them, and whether she feared or wished it most, she could scarcely determine. After sitting in this manner a quarter of an hour without hearing Miss Bingley's voice, Elizabeth was roused by receiving from her a cold inquiry after the health of her family. She answered with equal indifference and brevity, and the other said no more. The next variation which their visit afforded was produced by the entrance of servants with cold meat, cake, and a variety of all the finest fruits in season. But this did not take place till after many a significant look and smile from Mrs. Annesley to Miss Darcy had been given to remind her of her post. There was now employment for the whole party, for though they could not all talk, they could all eat, and the beautiful pyramids of grapes, nectarines, and peaches soon collected them round the table. While thus engaged, Elizabeth had a fair opportunity of deciding whether she most feared or wished for the appearance of Mr. Darcy by the feelings which prevailed on his entering the room. And then, though but a moment before she had believed her wishes to predominate, she began to regret that he came. He had been some time with Mr. Gardiner, who, with 2 or 3 other gentlemen from the house, was engaged by the river, and had left him only on learning that the ladies of the family intended a visit to Georgiana that morning. No sooner did he appear than Elizabeth wisely resolved to be perfectly easy and unembarrassed, a resolution the more necessary to be made, but perhaps not the more easily kept, because she saw that the suspicions of the whole party were awakened against them, and there was scarcely an eye which did not watch his behaviour when he first came into the room. In no countenance was attentive curiosity so strongly marked as in Miss Bingley's, in spite of the smiles which overspread her face whenever she spoke to one of its objects. For jealousy had not yet made her desperate, and her attentions to Mr. Darcy were by no means over. Miss Darcy, on her brother's entrance, exerted herself much more to talk, and Elizabeth saw that he was anxious for his sister and herself to get acquainted, and forwarded as much as possible every attempt at conversation on either side. Miss Bingley saw all this likewise, and in the imprudence of anger took the first opportunity of saying with sneering civility, "Pray, Miss Eliza, are not the militia removed from Meryton? They must be a great loss to your family." In Darcy's presence she dared not mention Wickham's name, but Elizabeth instantly comprehended that he was uppermost in her thoughts, and the various recollections connected with him gave her a moment's distress. But exerting herself vigorously to repel the ill-natured attack, she presently answered the question in a tolerably disengaged tone. While she spoke, an involuntary glance showed her Darcy with a heightened complexion, earnestly looking at her, and his sister overcome with confusion and unable to lift up her eyes. Had Miss Bingley known what pain she was then giving her beloved friend, she undoubtedly would have refrained from the hint, but she had merely intended to discompose Elizabeth by bringing forward the idea of a man to whom she believed her partial, to make her betray a sensibility which might injure her in Darcy's opinion, and perhaps to remind the latter of all the follies and absurdities by which some part of her family were connected with that corps. Not a syllable had ever reached her of Miss Darcy's meditated elopement. To no creature had it been revealed where secrecy was possible, except to Elizabeth. And from all Bingley's connections her brother was particularly anxious to conceal it, from that very which Elizabeth had long ago attributed to him, of their becoming hereafter her own. He had certainly formed such a plan, and without meaning that it should affect his endeavour to separate him from Miss Bennet, it is probable that it might add something to his lively concern for the welfare of his friend. Elizabeth's collected behaviour, however, soon quieted his emotion, and as Miss Bingley, vexed and disappointed, dared not approach nearer to Wickham, Georgiana also recovered in time, though not enough to be able to speak any more. Her brother, whose eyes she feared to meet, scarcely recollected her interest in the affair, and the very circumstance which had been designed to turn his thoughts from Elizabeth seemed to have fixed them on her more, and more cheerfully. Their visit did not continue long after the question and answer above mentioned, and while Mr. Darcy was attending them to their carriage, Miss Bingley was venting her feelings in criticisms on Elizabeth's person, behaviour, and dress. But Georgiana would not join her. Her brother's recommendation was enough to ensure her favour. His judgment could not err, and he had spoken in such terms of Elizabeth as to leave Georgiana without the power of finding her otherwise than lovely and amiable. When Darcy returned to the saloon, Miss Bingley could not help repeating to him some part of what she had been saying to his sister. "How very ill Eliza Bennet looks this morning, Mr. Darcy," she cried. "I never in my life saw anyone so much altered as she is since the winter. She has grown so brown and coarse. Louisa and I were agreeing that we should not have known her again." However little Mr. Darcy might have liked such an address, he contented himself with coolly replying that he perceived no other alteration than her being rather tanned, no miraculous consequence of travelling in the summer. "For my own part," she rejoined, "I must confess that I could never see any beauty in her. Her face is too thin, her complexion has no brilliancy, and her features are not at all handsome. Her nose wants character. There is nothing marked in its lines. Her teeth are tolerable, but nothing out of the common way. And as for her eyes, which have sometimes been called so fine, I could never perceive anything extraordinary in them. They have a sharp, shrewish look, which I do not like at all. And in her air altogether there is a self-sufficiency without fashion, which is intolerable." Persuaded as Miss Bingley was that Darcy admired Elizabeth, this was not the best method of recommending herself. But angry people are not always wise, and in seeing him at last look somewhat nettled, she had all the success she expected. He was resolutely silent, however, and from a determination of making him speak, she continued, "I remember when we all first knew her in Hertfordshire, how amazed we all were to find that she was a reputed beauty. And I particularly recollect your saying one night after they had been dining at Netherfield, 'She, a beauty, I should as soon call her mother a wit.' But afterwards she seemed to improve on you, and I believe you thought her rather pretty at one time." "Yes," replied Darcy, who could no longer contain himself, "but that was only when I first knew her, for it is many months since I have considered her as one of the handsomest women of my acquaintance." He then went away, and Miss Bingley was left to all the satisfaction of having forced him to say what gave no one any pain but herself. Mrs. Gardiner and Elizabeth talked of all that had occurred during their visit as they returned, except what had particularly interested them both. The looks and behaviour of everybody they had seen were discussed, except of the person who had mostly engaged their attention. They talked of his sister, his friends, his house, his fruit, of everything but himself. Yet Elizabeth was longing to know what Mrs. Gardiner thought of him, and Mrs. Gardiner would have been highly gratified by her niece's beginning the subject.
How does someone have uncommonly fine teeth?
What's that, my darling?
How does someone have uncommonly fine teeth? Like, her teeth were fine, but nothing out of the ordinary.
Tolerable.
They were lacking in bling.
Yeah, exactly. She didn't have her grill on.
Self-sufficient, and that's a bad thing.
Yeah.
I'd like to know what noses have character compared to what noses don't have character.
Charlotte.
Hi, Charlotte.
Charlotte.
My nose doesn't have character, but my mum's nose has character. I think it's one of these descriptions of like classic beauty of like a strong kind of nose, isn't it?
Is it?
Is it?
Yeah. Look at the noses on this call. I think Frankie's nose has character, and I don't know, does it? Turn sideways for us.
I think it does.
Yes, it does.
My enemy in high school told me that my nose was my best feature. So, thanks, I guess.
That just amplified your shrug, which I liked a lot.
Does it work for other gestures as well?
I don't know. I have to find out.
We'll have to find out.
Yeah.
So, how are we all feeling returning to Pemberley?
It's, you gotta love a man with a huge house.
A huge ... house.
A very handsome house.
A very handsome ... house.
I couldn't remember what happened on Friday. I was like, wait, what happened on Friday? Why are they here? I can't actually remember shit.
Also, like, he went and met like Mr. and Mrs. Gardner, and then he went away, and then they immediately started exclaiming as to what a fine figure he had. Like, if you introduce people to your aunt and uncle, do they immediately say, "What a hottie"?
Yeah.
If I introduce like a man to my aunt and uncle, I'm sure that the second he walked away, they'd be like, "Oh, what a fine figure of a man."
Yeah.
My mom would definitely.
House.
Whenever I introduce someone to my aunt, my aunt's response is always, "Put a ring on it, Abby. Put a ring on it." Any man.
Literally any man, even if you've just met at his house, despite not knowing that he's going to be there.
I think if he had a big house, that would definitely be her response.
So fascinating that she's like, oh, this guy, I've just seen his whole house, and like now, yeah, I'm looking at him in a completely different light now that I've seen his massive fucking house.
Yeah. He has a big house, and apparently now I believe that he's kind to poor people.
Yeah.
Oh, that whole scene with the servant person was terrible. Like, it was so awful. I hated every second of it.
Oh my god, Dina!
Really? Written by a rich person, like, oh, look at the rich person writing about a rich person whose servants like them. You're like,
Yeah,
that's
it was so
definitely
cringy.
He wasn't rich.
Aren't you like the most fortunate person in the world to have such a kind master?
It wasn't cringe. They were revealing stuff in the story there.
Yeah.
Like, not that he was great, but like, so like you could tell because like Mrs. Reynolds had a certain air that was very like Mr. Collins. Like she was all like, he's just amazing, he's the best, like exactly like Mr. Collins. And you kind of know that Mr. Darcy clearly tells all his servants, tell everyone that I'm amazing or I will kill you. And, you know, so they come by and it's like, he's just the best, please. And then that suddenly gives you the realization that, oh, maybe that's why Mr. Collins is like that. Because if he doesn't do all that, he is terrified for his life. He could lose it. You're slagging off Mr. Collins night after night, but he is a man in fear for his life. And he does so well.
I like to think that Lady Catherine just doms the fuck out of Mr. Collins. Like that's how I'm reading that dynamic.
Oh, vampires! They're using mind control.
Ooh.
Go to Rosings every day to be like nom-dom.
That's why they're always so grumpy, because they're like, oh, I have to kill these people and like consider my mortality on the daily. It's the whole thing.
I will say though, there are like something that are just very oh my god, sorry, I have my sound on one account and then
What?
Okay.
There's some things about Mr. Darcy that kind of remind me of some autism traits at times a little bit almost. Just in that he doesn't really latch on to a lot of social things and emotional states of other people. He like thinks very much in lists of facts. He's described as like being really quiet and not interacting with too many people, doesn't like to touch people he doesn't know well. So like it doesn't excuse his dickery, but there's like a series of things there.
Yeah, I noted the other night, I think that he's on the spectrum and that it changes how you read the book.
Or a vampire.
Or a vampire who sucks the blood of the poor.
Yes.
Mrs. Reynolds from like no, that's is that Renwick or Reynolds in
Renfield.
Renfield. Yeah, that guy.
That's his voice when we do Dracula in Storytime. Oh, he's gone. I'm having such a nice time, you guys.
Don't worry, we won't tell him.
If
you stop recording, he'll never know.
Oh, he does. Oh, he does. This is exactly is up on Storytime.
I'm texting him right now.
He also gets Storytime like live in person.
That is true. That is true. He was very good, actually. I thought he was going to be much more like distracting, but he mostly just sort of lay there and yawned, which was very, very cute.
He did not uphold the deal of signing in on his own computer screen.
I know, what a motherfucker.
Lulu point for that.
I know. Shall I dump him?
Yeah, no, definitely not. Frankie.
You can get some ideas from Lady de Bourgh.
And that's the relationship to aspire to in that book.
She's such goals. She's such #goals. Oh my god. How delighted. Oh, sorry, Gordon. What did you say, my darling?
No, there was one point where Elizabeth was saying something like, "I could have been the mistress of Pemberley," and there was looks from more than one person of, "Yes, you could."
Also, something about the master being flaming in reference to Darcy at one point.
Oh yeah, a flaming character.
There was also how he could bestow pleasure or pain as he worked
I
on
knew,
his servants.
as I was reading it, I knew that you would pick up on that, Gordon. I knew it.
Just like steady up. No, that's back to he's mean to them and, forces them to say things that makes them nice. Not in that sort of way. Stop the recording.
Okay, before I stop the recording, Gordon, did you have any notes? I will stop the recording. Did you want them recorded or should
Usually we stop before the notes.
Okay, everyone say goodbye to the catch-up crew.
Bye.
Bye, catch-up crew. Goodbye. We love you. Hope you enjoyed it.